Oh, there we go. Can you hear me a little better? Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2. Hope day 1 was great. By all accounts, we had some wonderful breakout sessions. I know Carol Birkin was fantastic. So I want to welcome you on behalf of the Illinois Council for History Education, the Missouri Council for History Education. Hope you've been enjoying yourself. Looking forward to another great keynote. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary.
Thank you. Hope everybody's well fed. We don't want anybody to go home hungry. If you do, it's your own fault. We have found over the years that if anybody complains, it's usually either about parking or the food. So parking is fairly convenient once you realize that it's right across the street. And if you're in by 8 and out before 7, you can get it for $7. So that works pretty good. We did have some questions yesterday. In the past, when we've been here, we've been able to reimburse a little bit, but we had a choice of either giving you $5 at the end of the day or raising the conference fee. And we figured that we would just save the in and out for us. So we do apologize about that. Would like to thank the presenters. We had more entries and recommendations for presentations than we had spaces. So if your presentation was not selected for this year, please submit for next year. We'd love to have you. And I've already been talking with some people about some possibilities and some ideas they have in the classroom that we can share with other people. So we'd love to have that. So when we get our conference date set for next year and our location, we'll send everybody a notice, and definitely watch our website. Tim is in charge of our website over there. If you are a presenter and you have additional materials, if you could email them to the MOCHE Gmail account, it's on the back of the brochure. We will put them on the website. We also will have a video of each of our keynote speakers. So that should be up within the next few days. So that'll be great. We do have a board of directors for Missouri. We'll be having an election come December or January. If you would be interested on serving on the board, we'd love to have you join us. And again, if you would email your interest to the MOCHE email, mohistoryeducation@gmail, and we would love to put you on the ballot. Send us a short bio, who you are and what level you teach and what you're interested in. At the end of the day, we might have a few books left over that aren't picked up after we do the raffle or things, and we'll put them on the front table as you go out. So if you would like to stop by and pick up any of those, you may do that. We'd love to have everybody take everything home so we don't have to carry it back. We want to again thank our sponsors. The Missouri Humanities Council has been very generous over the years in supporting our projects, our annual conference, so we can bring in people like Dr. Brown here to speak to us, and Carol Birkin yesterday, and our Visiting Scholars program, and a few other projects that we have in the works. And we'd hope to have Steve Belko with us this morning. Steve keeps accepting our invitation, and then something always comes up at the last minute. And we always remind him that when we ask for more money. So you can't make it, dear, but at least send us a check. We're glad to have that support. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our social studies coordinator for Missouri. Dixie, if you want to come down and introduce our Gilder Lehrman recipient for this year. Any questions that anybody has while Dixie makes her way down here? Any problems anybody ran into? We're glad St. Louis was quiet for the last few nights. Very grateful for that. I watch a lot of international news, and St. Louis even hit the German news over the weekend. And I'm going, okay, that's interesting. All right, Dixie.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today to publicly honor our 2017 Missouri History Teacher of the Year. This is an award that's sponsored by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. The Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History is a New York-based national nonprofit organization devoted to the teaching and learning of American history. Gilder Lehrman draws on top scholars, an unparalleled collection of historical documents, and a nationwide network of affiliate schools to create and provide resources for teachers. They also work to help new generations of American students learn about our history in a way that is engaging and memorable, and that promotes critical thinking and excellent writing. The Institute's programs have been recognized by awards by the White House, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Organization of American Historians. Beginning in 2004, Gilder Lehrman History Teacher of the Year Award highlights the crucial importance of history education by honoring exceptional American history teachers from elementary through high school. At our conference today, we have 3 previous Gilder Lehrman History Teacher of the Year awardees, Joan Musbach, Renee Maples, and Dr. Robert Good, all Missouri teachers honored by this award in years past. Today, we honor Robert Pritchard Jr. from St. Clair R13 School District as our Missouri Gilder Lehrman History Teacher of the Year from Missouri. Mr. Pritchard is a Social Studies Department Chair at St. Clair High School. He is an adjunct instructor of social studies education at East Central College and at Missouri Baptist College. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree and his Master of Arts degree from Truman State University, and he serves on many state, regional, and national professional organizations dedicated to the exploration of history and the enhancement of our teaching profession. Mr. Pritchard was awarded a monetary honorarium, and his school library recently received a core archive of history books and educational materials from the Gilder Lehrman Institute. In addition, Mr. Pritchard will receive an invitation to the 2018 Gilder Lehrman Teacher Seminar, a week-long program that offers teachers daily discussions with eminent historians, visits to historical sites, and hands-on work with primary sources. One of Mr. Pritchard's former principals said this when discussing Mr. Pritchard's classroom. He's one of the best at Socratic questioning I've ever seen. He'll coax, question, and pry so that a student ultimately reveals his own knowledge. I wish Mr. Pritchard could teach this technique to all of our teachers, whether it's in history or any other subject. Please join me now in my thank you to Mr. Robert Pritchard Jr. for his outstanding contributions to our profession, and most importantly, for his love of history that he shares with his students every day.
Thank you, Dixie. I'd now like to introduce another, in addition to being a Gilder Lehrman Award winner, our conference chair, Joan, and President Emeritus, last year was honored by the Missouri Humanities Council for excellence in education in 2016. So, Joan, it's yours.
Welcome again. I did want to say, when you go by the exhibit table for the St. Louis Fed Economic Education Department, say thank you to them. Okay. In the first place, the fact that you have lunch today is courtesy of the Economic Education Department of the Fed. They provide lunch for you today, as well as making this space available to us at no charge. And the fact that we have this wonderful space and excellent food and can keep registration fees at a minimum is just so invaluable. And do express your thanks to the employees there who are staffing the exhibit table as you go past. Sarah Drake Brown, our featured speaker today, is an associate professor of history at Ball State University. She received her BA in history from Illinois State, her MA in history from Purdue, and her PhD in curriculum studies from Indiana University. I first met Sarah when we worked together on an NCHE TAH grant colloquium in Polk County, Florida, and I was blown away by what a great presenter she was and how well she understood the duality between content and technique, pedagogy in the classroom. Could be that it has something to do with the fact that she started her career as a history teacher in Naperville, so she gets it. Since then, I have just over and over and over again thanked her for her work editing lessons for an NCHE grant that we had to do lesson plans for the podcast Backstory out of the University of Virginia. And I agreed to do the lessons, and of course I found that really fun, but editing is just way out of my wheelhouse. And the fact that they turned out to look so good, and the fact that I stayed out of the federal penitentiary for violations of copyright laws, it's all due to Sarah. So I'm indebted to her for many things, not the least of which is keeping me out of jail. She is a superb history educator. She has articles such as Bridging the Divide Between Content and Pedagogy, Reflective History Teacher. She's the Director of History and Social Studies Education at Ball State, and where she works with pre-service teachers and visits them in the classroom and helps them become good teachers as they start their career. Her articles also show her familiarity with the major topics that we're dealing with, things like assessment, using oral history, teaching historical thinking, and they all help us see, when you look at what she's published, the breadth and the depth of Sarah's historical knowledge. It's really a wonderful opportunity to have her with us today. One of the joys of putting the conference together is to bring to you people that I think are really superb exemplars of history and history education. In addition, Sarah is vice chair of the board of directors of the NCHE and will bring greetings from the national organization as well. So, Sarah?
I think I did what I'm supposed to do with the microphones, et cetera, so we're ready to go. Thank you, Joan, for that very kind introduction. It's funny, though, because to be honest with you, I'm just Sarah Drake from Dwight, Illinois, and I like history teaching, and that about sums it up. I'm really grateful, though, to have the opportunity to speak with you this morning about issues pertaining to the teaching and learning of history. And so I'd like to take a moment, first of all, to thank the Missouri Council for History Education and the Illinois Council for History Education for inviting me here. And I would especially like to thank Joan. As Joan mentioned, she and I first worked together at an NCHE colloquium in Polk County, Florida, and we did another one in West Virginia. And for those of you who are not familiar with the NCHE model, what we do in professional development is we send a team to work with teachers, and the person who is organizing this colloquium identifies certain things that they think their teachers could benefit from. And then the team, which consists of a historian, a history education specialist, and a master teacher, works together to plan either a 3 to 5 day workshop for teachers. I served as the history ed specialist, and so my role really was always just, I felt, to remind teachers what they already knew how to do and to help them in some concentrated time think about how they might implement some of these ideas with their students. I loved working with Joan because she embodies a master teacher. All of the lessons that she demonstrated and shared with teachers were on point, were student-centered, and were content-rich. And so you could never really ask for anything more. As she mentioned, I also had the privilege of working with her on the Backstory project. And so what we had to do was take the Backstory radio podcasts and develop lessons from them. It doesn't sound all that hard, except it actually really is. And when NCHE asked me to do this, I said, well, okay, this sounds like a good thing, but I don't know, what teacher are you going to have be doing the actual work. And they said, Joan, and I said, I'm in. This will be good. The only complaint I had in working with Joan is that she oftentimes gave me lessons way before I was ready to look at them and do my part. And she's a workhorse, as you know, and you're also privileged to have her both organizing this conference and advocating so strongly for history teachers in the Midwest. So thank you again, Joan, and I think we need to give you a round of applause. Joan asked me, as she stated, to just speak briefly again about NCHE. I understand that Dean talked to you yesterday about some of the origins of the organization and its history. And since its founding in the late 1980s and early 1990s, NCHE has always been an advocate for history teachers and making sure that as our teachers connect with students, they also connect with the public. And therefore, our kind of guiding principle that was first articulated by historian Kenneth Jackson, more history, better taught, is meant to remind teachers that they're already doing an outstanding job and we can always do more. One of our major goals in the National Council for History Education is to support teachers through professional development. And we have been fortunate enough in this time of restrained budgets and not a lot of money going toward professional development to have been awarded a grant through the Teaching with Primary Sources project at the Library of Congress. And so our grant that we have currently running now focuses on technology's impact in American history. The way that we designed this grant is we have partnered with 3 specific sites at the NASA and dealing with NASA and flight technology. We partnered with the Astronauts Memorial Foundation at the Kennedy Space Center. Focusing on technological innovation and patents, we partnered with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And then looking at the Army and the technology of warfare, we partnered with the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. Over approximately the past year, we've been running professional development for teachers. And if you join this professional development, you can get your picture taken and be featured in a slideshow by someone from NCHE in the future. So this is an example of some professional development that took place at the Army Heritage Center. Then we had at the U.S. Patent Offices, teachers working to consider the springboard for innovation and technological advances. And then obviously this is working with NASA. This is the Rocket Garden at the Kennedy Space Center. And if you're really lucky, then you get to get your picture taken with an astronaut. So I wanted to let you know that soon on NCHE's website, we will have information so that you can join and participate in this professional development. We will be beginning next January at the Kennedy Space Center. Then in March, we'll be at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And then over the summer, we'll be at the Army Heritage and Education Center. Please do consider at least taking a look at this, telling your friends it's coming on our website soon, and I think it'll be fantastic. I also wanted to encourage you to consider coming to our national conference this year, April 19th through 21st in the spring in San Antonio. We did not plan this, but our conference theme, Myths, Monuments, and Memories, is very timely. And we will be accepting presentations through, I believe, October. Is that right? October 16th. So please consider attending. Please consider submitting a session, and we hope to see you there. All right, now I have to switch out of advertising for NCHE and go into what we're supposed to be doing now. All right, there we are. Over the past 120 years, historians, history teachers, and researchers in history education have issued various calls emphasizing the importance of cultivating teachers' and students' historical mindedness. The American Historical Association's 1898 report, The Study of History in Schools, drew attention to the importance of a history teacher's expertise in disciplinary ways of knowing. So we've been talking about this for a very, very long time. The report's authors, the Committee of Seven, noted, to cultivate historical mindedness, to teach pupils to think historically, and to approach facts with the historical spirit. This is the chief object of instruction in the field of history. But unless the teacher has practice in dealing with facts, unless the teacher has acquired perspective, unless the teacher has become historical minded and knows him, or I would add herself, what the historical method is, he or she cannot instruct his pupils. A main purpose of my comments this morning is to focus on what we, as history educators across the K-16 continuum, might do to improve the teaching and learning of history, and specifically to improve students' historical mindedness. Contrary to popular belief, I actually think we're already doing a pretty good job. However, I always think that we can do more. And so before we begin to focus on ourselves and our work, we should, as we always do, start with our students. To that end, I ask you to consider, how have your students experienced history? So if you were to ask your students the question, how have you experienced history? What would they say? How would they respond? So I know this is like out of the ordinary with a keynote address, but I would like to not talk for a moment and have you talk to your neighbor. And so let's do a think, pair, share. And so please talk with your neighbor about how your students would respond to this question, how have you experienced history? Okay, so I'd like to let you talk forever, and I know you will, but maybe we could hear what we've been talking about. So, what do you think they would say? How have if you asked your students, how have you experienced history, what would they say? And since they're recording, would you please, when you say what you're going to say, press the little button in front of your microphone so they can pick it up? What would they say? Yeah.
Does it work?
Yes.
I feel like I'm in the UN. Rocket Man. I think that somebody got it.
I got it.
My two things were, if they look at it from my history class, it was either I haven't learned anything or it's about a bunch of boring dead white guys. And then if it's what have I experienced in my life, we are to the point now that freshmen down, nobody was alive during September 11th. And I feel like that was, in our minds, the last major event that had happened in history that changed history. Because, I mean, you could argue that a lot of things happening now stem back to that. And so that's what we were talking about was, if it's what have I experienced in my lifetime, a lot of them say nothing. And if it's what have I experienced in my history class, it's either it's boring and it's about a bunch of dead white guys, or if it's fun, I can say, oh, good, and, you had a great time, what'd you learn? And they just kind of look at you with a blank stare and they didn't learn anything. But it was fun. So.
My son is a sophomore, and he experiences history through social media. Through, he finds out about what's going on through, like YouTube and Instagram and things like that.
All right, so social media plays a big role, especially in our students' lives today. What else?
We talked over here a lot about movies. Forrest Gump, The Patriot, Glory, that students experience history through watching it through the Hollywood's lens.
A lot of times through the through media, that lens is really important and gives us a good opportunity to talk about things in the classroom. How else? Yeah.
That reminded me of a conversation I had with a student about last week. It's amazing actually how much more they know about certain topics than I do, especially related to their video game playing. So if students that play Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed are sort of two classic examples of historically based video gaming, they know more, again, sometimes more about the details than I do related to those topics. We also talked about travel. Students who have had opportunities to travel have that connection experience to some history there as well. And especially, a lot of my students who are deeply connected to the current protesting. Had a student on the front page of the Post last week, the fact that they feel that they're living through a historical moment. And not only since some of the protesting is happening in their backyard, but also some of them are participating. So I think in some ways we're living through a very unique moment as history teachers to sort of kind of seize that moment and seize that opportunity to teach this current generation.
It is a really good time, actually, to be a history teacher, but a time that we face a lot of responsibility with what we'll do with the fact, the environment that we exist in our classrooms. You had mentioned the role that video games may play in really giving students a structure and a background, and there are some specific things we might do with those as teachers. There's an article that's coming out in a journal called Teaching History, a Journal of Methods this fall that was written by a college professor, but I think it may be to varying extents applicable for high school teachers as well. And so you can look for that. I'm shameless. I'm the editor of the journal, so that's why I know it's coming out. But if you'd like, I can give you some more information on that afterwards. But that idea of traveling too, and so not just experiencing history kind of in your own environment, but going and seeing different places is a way to experience history. What else? Yeah.
I think one of the things that we discussed was the need to actually define what history is, because a lot of students might not realize that, hey, you are actually experiencing history. And I think the conversation was a high school student versus, say, an elementary or a middle school student might not be making that connection, and so they actually are experiencing history, but might not be realizing because their context is it's older people from a
Yeah.
long time ago, and they're all dead now.
Yeah.
So having the conversation, I think, of exactly what history is and could be,
Yeah.
might determine how they answer that question.
And going to a family reunion. I mean, this is experiencing history. It just doesn't seem necessarily like it because it isn't boring, right? And history is supposed to be boring. Yeah.
We actually talked about how our students have experienced history. Many of my students in my college, their families lost their job in Chrysler and their home in 2008, 2009. They can't explain why. And my partner works at a place with a lot of immigration, particularly immigrants from South Asia, and their families have migrated here, and they know their personal story why, but they're not quite sure how that fits in a larger macro-level trend. So I think there are people experiencing history. They may not understand it at its highest level, but they're certainly living it out.
They're living it out, they're experiencing it, they're not quite sure how it connects to all these other stories that are being told, maybe. I asked my students this question, and one more, though, I want to hear. Yeah?
I've experienced history through living through technological change.
Oh,
Upgrades in their iPhone, iWatch, driving in their family a hybrid or electric car, upgrades in computers and the dangers of hacking and your credit card numbers being hacked and your Starbucks account being hacked, and considering going into college to go into coding, computer programming.
Yeah, and boy, that fits really well with the NCHE professional development that we're running right now, the impact of technology in American history. So there are a lot of avenues to explore this idea with our students. When I asked my students this question, they wrote a bunch of different things on the board, and some of the things that you guys have picked up on, definitely that your students would say. Movies and TV, through travel, visiting historic sites. These people that I was working with are in college, and so they're able to definitely refer to 9/11. They consider themselves the post 9/11 generation. They talked about visiting monuments. You can see, it's always important to contextualize yourself in time, and you can see this was at the beginning of the semester because they put the solar eclipse down there because it was the day after it. And then they got a little bit political with their experiences. 2 wars, 1 based off a lie. I just wrote down whatever they said. So, but they have all these ideas about history. A lot of you, we started off with the idea that if they experience it in the classroom, it's boring, it's terrible. But I don't believe that in your classroom. I think that in the classroom working with you, it's likely that they have experienced history as an investigation into the past, a co-investigation, you and your students working together, and that you've emphasized the importance of primary sources. And so, as you've worked with students to help them differentiate between the past and history, because those things are very different, you've undoubtedly discussed the means through which traces from the past have become history. And so how do traces from the past become history? You've probably discussed with your students how something exists from the past, and this something, what we'll come to use the term primary source, has to first be preserved. The idea, at least when I've worked with middle school students in the past, that things actually have to be saved, they get it, but then they don't sometimes. And so the idea that not everything that happened in the past is stuff that we can look at today is a pretty important idea to help them consider. Of course, then it's crucial that this item from the past that has been preserved has to be found, and it has to be deemed significant. And that's where it gets really interesting, because historical significance is an extremely important concept to consider with our students. We might ask, how do people decide if something is significant? In the big picture, we can consider, did this thing result in change? If so, change for whom? Change for how long? What did this change mean? Does the source that we're working with reveal something? What? Again, for whom? In what context? It's all about the questions that we ask, a lot of times, that make something significant historically. And then, once we've decided that this source is significant and we need to focus on it, then the source becomes interpreted. Historians give meaning to the past through this source by interpreting it in context, and it becomes evidence. And then finally, all of these different sources are incorporated into meaningful historical narratives. And so we began to weave together an understanding of the past as we breathe life into it and give it meaning in specific narratives. Now, we know that we cannot do the work of history with our students if we don't introduce them to primary sources and if we don't dive into primary sources with them. They're fundamental, they're key, and they're a lot of fun. But are we perhaps focused too much on primary sources? I realize that I may be committing heresy here, but stay with me for a minute. In our emphasis on teaching the work of the historian, have we inadvertently left out a crucial element? Are we so focused on primary sources that we have forgotten that sources are really only significant when they are part of meaningful narratives? Lyndall Calder, a historian at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois, published an article in the OAH Magazine of History in 2013 titled "The Stories We Tell." In this article, he articulated a concern that students have lost the ability to narrate our nation's past. His work started, as he documented in this article, in 1994. And in 1994, he began asking undergrads in his U.S. history survey to imagine they had the opportunity to tell the history of the United States to a stranger from another country. The catch was they had to do this in 600 words or less without looking anything up. Calder explains that when he first gave this assignment, way back in the mid-90s, nearly all the students told a somewhat similar story. While the details of the story were understandably all over the place, the students generally followed what Bruce Van Sledwright has termed a freedom quest narrative. You know it, you're familiar with it. Liberty, equality, prosperity, power, progress, a glory story of the United States. Some students, however, told a gory story. The story kind of went like full of malevolence and greed. The United States was a hypocritical bully in search of global domination. Other students told a story of high ideals and mixed results. The story went like a noble nation that was ambitious, tried really hard to live up to its ideals, and sometimes it didn't turn out all that well, and we came up short. Finally, a small group of students offered a chaos story. This story was absent of characters, plot, conflict, or themes, and these narratives were often just lists of events. In 2000, Calder developed a rubric, and he began formally tracking the storylines that his students were using. He saw a major shift in the stories that students told between 2000 and 2011. And so we can look briefly at the figure that he created to capture the shift in stories. But what this means is by 2011, nearly 75% of his students told a story that was actually not a story at all. Rather, it was a listing of events with few or no connections. Simply, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. There wasn't a theme of triumph or tragedy. There wasn't a theme at all. It was just nothing. Richard Hughes at Illinois State and I have used similar assignments in our classes, and our tentative findings align with those of Calder. What was a bit disconcerting about Richard and my study was that the students that Calder asked were students in a survey U.S. history class. The students that we were asking were upper-level history majors, and still they didn't really have much of a story. So where has narrative gone, and does it matter? Today I suggest that it actually does matter quite a lot, and that we need to focus on the meaning in primary sources and the narratives that emerge when historians work with these sources. So if we go back to helping our students understand how the past becomes history, and we focus on the traces and the sources that we're working with, perhaps we can really focus more on those last two elements. The idea of how historians bring meaning to the past through interpretation, and how these interpretations are then incorporated into existing narratives, or how these interpretations challenge existing narratives. Coherent stories, even stories that make us uncomfortable or that we simply don't agree with, contribute to our experiences as human beings. Even more important, it is critical for all students as active participants in civic life. And this includes our students who are citizens, those who are legal immigrants, and those who are undocumented. All students in the United States must be able to read or listen to a story and go beyond simple agreement or dismissal of ideas. We live in a world where alternative facts and unsubstantiated opinions are weakening our ability to engage in discussion. Convoluted judicial rulings are undermining the very fabric of our republic. But it does little good for our students to simply proclaim that person is an idiot. That's not going to get us anywhere. When our students take to the streets in protest, they do so rightfully with passionate conviction and with emotion. It is our responsibility as teachers of history to make sure that they have the intellectual foundation that sharpens their arguments and gives their energy purpose. So, how might we better help students understand the complex nature of the stories that document a very messy past, and how might we prepare them to think about participating in crafting the stories of what will undoubtedly be a very messy future? While I cannot offer a surefire solution, I would like to explore with you today the potential of making narratives a central element of historical thinking. In this proposal, I do not mean that we should shift our focus entirely or lessen our emphasis on primary sources. We need to continue to explore the 5 C's of historical thinking as articulated by Flannery Burke and Thomas Andrews. And as you know, these include change over time, causality, context, complexity, and contingency. But what we might do is alter our focus and emphasize how historians use these concepts, these 5 C's of historical thinking, when they give meaning to the past through interpretive narratives. So we still need to use primary sources, but sorry, we've got to do more. When we use primary sources, what's nice is that the National Council for History Education has made suggestions already and has identified specific habits of mind that we as teachers can help our students demonstrate. For example, NCHE advocates strongly that we must teach students to recognize that history is an evolving narrative constructed from available sources, cogent inferences, and changing interpretations. It isn't made up. We don't use alternative facts. It isn't somebody's opinion. We use evidence to support the claims we put forward, but it is open to interpretation. And that's where it gets really interesting. As Arthur Chapman has explained, histories are always narratives to one degree or another, and writing a story involves a series of identifications and decisions, all of which are shaped by the assumptions and identities of the story's narrator. Stories are important, and we learn the structure of a compelling story at a young age. My 8-year-old son told a particularly good story over breakfast this past weekend. And when I commented on how well it was organized and how much I wanted to pay attention to it, and I didn't tell him this, but Thankfully, it was not like about Lego Star Wars or something like that, because I couldn't handle it if it were going to be. But when I said, this was really great, you had such a good organizational structure, you made me want to listen, you drew me in, he was, of course, very pleased, but he was excited to tell me he did this on purpose, and he had learned how to do that at school. So, I'm in now. I'm like, okay, even if it were about Lego Star Wars, now I'm totally listening. And you'll probably recognize this summarizing strategy for young learners. He told me it was just quite simply the somebody wanted, but, so, then structure. And without being too simplistic, having read Carol's book that she talked about yesterday, I'd say that structure is apparent in her chapter on the Whiskey Rebellion. Think about it. Hamilton wanted, but Americans in different regions. So Washington, then the American people, it works, right? We know that history is more than telling a story, and Carol would likely not be pleased if I insinuated that I thought that framework represents the totality of her thinking and the art of crafting a historical interpretation. But what a good starting point for our young learners. And we can take that starting point and expand the idea of the structure of stories, the structure of what become interpretations as we move into the middle and high school level. So as students progress and we make our telling of narratives more historical in nature, we have to help them recognize that writing in history is based on a close attribution of sources and an infrastructure where argument and justification for decisions made exists alongside a commitment to constant debate and continuous evaluation. It's no longer just a summary or a story, but a constant dialogue that can be verified and cross-checked. So, historians can't make things up, and they can't say whatever they feel like when they craft narratives that give meaning to the past. And of course, neither can teachers. So how do we organize and introduce students to the stories we tell? Because we all tell stories in class, right? Everybody knows that we do it. Our students actually love it. When you ask people who are history majors in college, why did you want to be a history major? A lot of them say, because we love stories. Because I had a history teacher who told good stories. And so it's a great responsibility we have. So how do we do it? How do we organize these? Peter Seixas provides an overview of 3 very different interpretations, or orientations rather, that teachers can use. First, teachers can offer the best interpretation of the past. Of course, this approach begs the question, which version of the past will be told? Seixas's point, however, is not to enter culture wars or to advocate for a specific version. Rather, he asks what the single best version might provide for society as a whole. Why are we tempted to take this approach? It can provide identity, cohesion, and social purpose. Identity and cohesion will, of course, be based on who is included and who is marginalized in the story. Social purpose can be advanced through the moral framework offered by this best story. But of course, this is a very problematic vision for history in the schools, and Seixas labels it so. The decision has to be made about a version of history to teach, and then history simply becomes dogma, a tale to be absorbed and memorized. Historical knowledge is fixed under this model, and it's fixed by authority rather than being subject to investigation and debate. The second orientation that teachers might use involves history being taught in schools as disciplined knowledge, as a way of knowing. Teachers operating under this approach ask students to recognize the uniqueness of the past and focus less on making overt connections between the past and the present. Students question historical accounts, examine the evidence on which interpretations are based, and consider it in relation to competing accounts. As Satius explains, this approach engages students in building historical knowledge and criticizing others' historical accounts. Instead of promoting identity fissures, it offers the promise of deliberative distance, which only a broad historical view can achieve. Critics of this orientation worry that students will be lost to relativism if they are told history is not just the facts. More on this in a minute. Those who seek to use history to promote national unity are also dismayed by this approach. Finally, critics wonder if people are not connected to their roots and are not studying history to promote the idea of a common past or to bring historical perspective to social justice issues, will history matter? A third orientation for teachers in the classroom is postmodern. I can see people like rolling their eyes and gasping in horror here. It's okay. I love postmodernism because I almost understand it. It's, yeah. To me, it's like when you're sitting at your kitchen counter and there's a fruit fly flying over your bananas and you're like, I've got it, and you get it, and then you're like, I missed it. That's how I always feel when I read postmodern things. Like, I almost have it, and then it's gone. So I'll come back again and try later. In examining the postmodern challenge to history in the schools, Satius surveys the narrativity of history, the positionality of historians, the limitations of progress, and the textuality of sources. In the chapter where he outlines these ideas, he does so clearly and with great meaning over, as you might imagine with postmodernism, several pages. For our purposes here, though, I think we might slightly temper postmodernism just a bit and simply think about it as, why do we have different stories about the past? How did they arrive? What are their consequences? What is historical knowledge, and how does it relate to power? So we have three options. We can, in our classrooms, tell stories through the collective memory, best story approach. And we're tempted to do it, but we know we shouldn't, and we hopefully don't. And we can use disciplinary inquiry and postmodernism. So let's focus on disciplinary inquiry and what postmodernism could offer our students. When we talk about disciplinary inquiry, we have to make sure that we are aware of and that our students are aware of big ideas that frame our purposes as teachers and as students of history. So our students need to understand, and you note it's not history here, but histories, that histories, plural, are representations and constructions of the past. They are inherently plural and variable, that they exist in time and change with time, that they are authored and shaped by the subjectivity of their authors, and that they typically are narratives grounded in evidence and argument. So history is a discipline, and it's an interpersonal practice. It has rules. We need to follow the rules. We strive for objectivity, but we know we're human beings, and we can't really take ourselves out of it. So we do the best that we can, and we follow the rules of the discipline. These rules are applied to the construction of narratives. Why does it matter if students learn about the construction of narratives and specifically about the structure of historical interpretations? Well, these ideas are central to a lot of things that matter to us, not just as history teachers, but as individuals in a civil society, and also as individuals who just have concern over the teaching and learning of our youth, regardless of the subject matter of expertise that we hold. But if we focus specifically on history, the idea of understanding historical interpretations is really central to the concept of information literacy and citizenship. We talked a lot earlier about how our students are digital natives. Well, they know that there's this phone is this thing, and they use it all the time, and they like would be blown away if they knew that they had to dial somebody, go, right? They couldn't handle that. But a lot of times they aren't really all that aware of what they're doing. And last November, the Stanford History Education Group came out with a study that demonstrated that our adolescents' civic knowledge and ability to actually navigate and read things on the internet successfully is really in question. And it's something that we need to work on. Our students encounter multiple representations and interpretations in the present every day. Many of these representations reference the past, and so it's important to ground their understanding in a firm foundation of historical knowledge. But as they do so, we want our students to do more than just provide simplistic and reductive interpretations and explanations for what has happened. We also want students to think about their own thinking, and we want them to be reflective and not simply absorb history, but to actually consider its structure and its argument. If students learn that, if they just learn historical claims without understanding how these claims are made, then of course they're just going to think that history is an opinion. So they have to be exposed to history as a discipline that has structure, rules, and things that most of the time historians follow. Finally, they need to understand the concept of historicity and understand that interpretations are made in specific contexts at specific times and that they can change. And then finally, it's important for our students to be exposed to interpretations because not everything is just about today or even about tomorrow. It's not about going to college or getting a job. It's about being a well-rounded person who can think, react, and respond in various situations. And examining the structure of narratives and thinking about how these stories are told and why can contribute to individuals' life once they leave us from high school. Okay, so the past is useful in relation really to the questions that one asks. It never provides us with an answer. We're not starting with an answer and then looking for information to get us to that answer. We're starting with questions. And the study of history can help us ask better questions as we offer explanations. As people in the United Kingdom noted last January, understanding the past, its construction nature, and historical thinking can be useful in times of protest. Okay, so this is funny, but what does it mean actually in our classrooms every day? The sign is amusing, but how did these people's history teachers prepare them for this, shall we say, civic life? How have teachers used narratives or interpretations in the history classroom? When we have conflicting interpretations of the present or the past, what might teachers do? Well, we can use disciplinary inquiry and enter the postmodern terrain with our students. We can read historical interpretations with students and teach them to hold these interpretive narratives up to question, be they textbook explanations or excerpts from monographs. That's disciplinary inquiry. And we can teach students to question these interpretations based on why the school wants to read this, have them read this narrative and learn this narrative in the first place. Why did you, as my teacher, choose it? That's edging gently into postmodernism. So let's make this a little bit more concrete with an example. In the Reading Like a Historian materials that I'm sure you guys are all really familiar with, that are available both online and in a book format from the Stanford History Education Group, Some lessons are devoted to the incorporation of historiography, or the history of the writing of history. In other words, in some lessons, students are asked to confront competing historical narratives, not just competing accounts told in primary sources, but in historians' explanations of events. For example, in one reading like a historian lesson, students consider the causes of the Dust Bowl. In addition to reading several accounts from two individuals who lived through the Dust Bowl and analyzing an image, students read 3 government reports. But that's not all. They start with these primary sources, but then in this particular lesson, they do more. They consider the interpretations of historians Donald Worcester and R. Douglas Hurt. While historians agree on the causes of Dust Bowl storms, lack of conservation of soil, over-farming, mechanization, the consequences of busting the sod, etc., interpretations diverge when we consider why people engaged in these practices to begin with. Worcester attributes the Dust Bowl to capitalism and the quest for profit. Hurt's narrative doesn't ignore capitalism, but he emphasizes the interplay between natural and man-made contributions. So this lesson highlights the fact that historians disagree. It provides students with the opportunity to consider how historians can examine the same evidence and find different meanings in the evidence, or by asking different questions, the evidence deemed significant changes. They aren't making it up. Instead, they are assigning meaning to the past. So, why do this with students? I mean, this is a lot of work. Why expose them to the nature of history? Don't they just need to know some stuff so they can perform well on standardized tests now and help us out today, and then later in life they can look smart when it's trivia night at the local bar? Isn't that really what we want? Well, sure, and we know, this is the important thing, that rival narratives exist in our contemporary world. And so we can't have them just saying, well, this is just someone's opinion, people make this stuff up. We have to teach them to think about where these narratives are coming from and why. But when we have so much content to cover, and our students have so many very real and pressing needs, why teach the concept of valid historical interpretation? In the words of historian Frederick Drake, who pursued this very work with high school students, how can we do this without inculcating the notion that history is merely a collection of pretentious opinions or propagandistic assertions without any substantive basis? In the 1980s, Drake advocated the use of a teaching model that would offer students an intellectual rationale for explaining and understanding why historians, using divergent source material, may arrive at differing conclusions. The insights students gain can allow them to differentiate mere argumentation and opinion from logically reasoned deductions based on historical evidence. This historian, who conducted this quasi-experimental research when he was a high school teacher, found that if students were exposed to primary sources and then to interpretations and different historiographical schools of thought, they were more likely to perceive history as interpretation rather than mere opinionated argument. They were also less likely to view history as an accumulation of facts, with the past never changing. So, primary sources aren't enough. Historiography alone isn't enough. When we provide students with the full spectrum of the work of the historian, when we teach them to read and question primary sources, and we teach them to read and question narrative accounts or secondary sources, to consider historiography, then they can begin to recognize the constructed nature of the past. It isn't meaningless. It isn't made up. It certainly isn't opinion. It is something like contemporary issues today that we can talk about and that we can argue about. And we substantiate these arguments with evidence. As Robert Parks asserts, when history is understood as historical representation, engaging with histories historiographically becomes a tool to navigate through and between multiple and conflicting historical narratives. This move allows us to understand and appreciate rival narratives and also to recognize that all historical narratives are not necessarily equal. When our students have begun to experience the power and promise of this full range of disciplinary inquiry, they can then begin to question the structure of those narratives themselves. They might ask, why does the textbook tell the story this way? Why did you, my teacher, only show me these primary sources? What's driving your narrative? Some of our better students, if they don't ask us these questions, are likely thinking them. But in interviews with teachers about their use of historiography in the classroom, a colleague and I have found that sometimes teachers do kind of meander their way toward these types of questions with students, but it isn't as purposeful and systematic as we might hope. We need to engage all of our students in this way of thinking and questioning. We need to communicate to all of our students that even the authoritative voice of the teacher can and should be questioned in our classrooms. Several years ago, Frederick and I published an article in the History Teacher that outlined what we termed a systematic approach to improve students' historical thinking. This method draws from communicative action theory and theories of discourse. And the idea behind the method is that we all know the great feeling that we have when we've been working with documents in class and then a student comes in on his or her own and brings in a source that they've gone off and found because it's kind of related to what we're doing. We feel great, but it's so happenstance and not everybody does it. It's just kind of a one-off thing. And so we thought, why not make this process a bit more deliberate and purposeful? And also while we're at it, why not emphasize the importance of history-based discussion in the classroom? So we designed a model, and in this method, the teacher sets the intellectual direction for a series of methods based on the sources that a teacher picks. These sources are organized, however, in a particular way. The way that it starts off is the teacher begins by choosing what we label a first-order document. And this document is a source that gets to the heart of the historical time period. It gets to the heart of the issue at hand. And it provides a vivid expression of some ideas in this period. This is where this idea of historical significance really comes in. How do you select such a document? So we argue that, first of all, one of the most important things is it has to resonate with the teacher. And I know that I am overly dramatic, but I actually think this is true. We all know how hard our lives are as teachers. So when your alarm goes off at 5 in the morning, the wind chill is 13 below, and you have to go to practice after you've taught all day, and your alarm goes off, you slap at it and hit snooze, and you think, what are we doing at school today? Then you leap out of bed because you know that today you are using Pericles' funeral oration because this is your first order document. This is the most essential thing to your teaching about this time period, and now you're set, right? Okay. But really, we all know that we think as teachers, there are certain things that resonate with us. There are certain things that get us more excited than other sources. And so why not capture our own excitement and our own intellectual direction and use that in the classroom with our students? So we pick this first order document, and we don't just do it because we love it. We also, as I said before, focus on its historical significance. We think about its value as a historical source. This doesn't mean, when I talk about historical significance, it doesn't mean that it has to be a government document or a speech or something from a great figure in history. It can be something from someone who nobody really knows, but the trace from the past was preserved and found, and the idea of this common individual resonates at the heart of what you want to explore with your students. That is also a first order document. So, big man, sure. If you want to look at FDR's Quarantine the Aggressor speech, and that's your most important source, do it. If you want to study how somebody from Chandlerville, Illinois, felt about being drafted in World War II, and you have that person's letter, and that gets to the heart of the issue you're examining with your students, do it. So, you also have to think, of course, about how this will connect with your students, how it will help them build their historical reasoning and understanding. And then what you do is you surround this with other sources. Of course, we know that history is about asking good questions. And so based on your first order document and the position that it articulates, you pose for your students an open-ended central historical question that, of course, begins with how and why, how or why. It's interpretive. So when I show people in my teacher ed program the thinking that goes behind this and how we do this, I feel like I'm in a chemistry class because I draw it on the board and it ends up looking like an atom or molecule thing. But I couldn't make PowerPoint do that, so I gave up. But your first order document is at the center. And then you surround it with 3 to 5 what we term second order sources. And these second order sources either support or contest. So they corroborate or they challenge the position taken by that first order source. This is a really fun part when this plays out in the classroom because you get to help students realize that primary sources talk to each other. So they're talking to the first order document. They're talking to each other in that surrounding second level circle. And we're seeing how people in this time period, or possibly also using secondary sources here, are thinking about this issue that you've selected. When we developed this model, we suggested that people consider using at least one image as second order sources, simply because too much text, we know, is always overwhelming for students, but when you bring in maps, political cartoons, photographs, paintings, it just makes us so much more well-rounded in our exploration of the past with students. And so the teacher and the students are working together over the course of several days to try to, through mutual discussion and a co-investigation of the past, to try to sort out how we might answer that central historical question based on these sources. But of course, this is really still heavily controlled by the teacher. The teacher is setting this narrative agenda by source selection. And so this final stage is what is key. The students then bring in a third order source. And sometimes we know that some people can do this the first day of class. They can go out, and I don't just mean Google it, but they can go out and find a source that will either support or challenge your first order source. They can do this on their own very easily. Other people need a lot more support. So when I've done this at the high school level and at the middle school level with students in my classes, I often provide a list of potential sources students might want to look at, and I will even, if they really need more than a list, have a packet of several copies of sources they could look at. So they don't have to go out and find it on their own. As you know, there are always different ways to adapt to the needs of our learners. The big point here, though, with this third order source is that now the students are talking back to the teacher. And the source that they identify either supports or challenges the position taken by the teacher in that first order document. So they are actively engaged in crafting their own interpretation. They're actively engaged in seeking out positions that support or challenge that of the teacher. They aren't offering an opinion. They aren't making it up. They're engaging in sources and using evidence, and they're going to craft a narrative. So when I've used this method with students over the years, I think I've actually been making a mistake, because I admittedly have only emphasized primary sources. Fred Drake and I put secondary sources in the article that we wrote about this. We didn't really give very many examples of that. We didn't really talk about historical interpretation. We just kind of let it hang there, and we were obsessed with primary sources. And I think that was a mistake. I'm now convinced that in order to truly bring out the potential in this method, we need to better communicate the importance of incorporating secondary sources into this model, using historians' narratives and bringing those into the dialogue that teachers have with their students as they investigate the meaning of the past. All right, so this is really hard work, right? But you're already doing hard work, so why not do more? And our students can do it. They really can. They won't do it perfectly, but everybody can do something. The other day, I observed a 6th grade girl who was reading sources, and I asked her why certain outcomes occurred pertaining to the sources she was reading. She crossed her arms, and she replied, "Because people have always treated women like they are meek and men are superior." And I was like, well, there's nothing meek about you. Okay. She has a narrative framework, right? All of our students, even the ones who aren't as vocal as this young lady was, come to us with narrative frameworks. They are not blank slates. They pay close attention. They live very much in the world around us. What we have to do is help them weave context for these existing narrative frameworks, weave context for their interpretations, and then teach them how to use evidence to buttress their claims. We can show them how to incorporate their own interpretations into existing narratives or how to challenge existing narratives. We cannot simply ask them to read some primary sources and treat the rich information in these sources as facts to be memorized. We don't want students to emerge from our classes knowing a lot of stuff that they can recite as a chaos story. Our students deserve more. We must help them learn to place their ideas into an interpretive narrative. It's very easy today as history teachers to feel used, abused, and powerless. I'm not naive. I know that when testing takes place in schools, extra review time gets taken from the history class. When counselors need to meet with students to go over their course schedules for the next year, they take the class time of the history teacher. Elementary school teachers are under increasing pressure to devote time in class to reading and to STEM. Researchers report that we are lucky if elementary teachers can squeeze a few minutes of history into their schedule. My son is in 3rd grade, and he has an outstanding, energetic, compassionate, and brilliant teacher who connects with and inspires students. I love Mr. Jankowski. I cannot believe how fortunate we are that my son has Mr. Jankowski. He's everything that I know you guys are. Last weekend, he came to Nathan's soccer match just because he could see at recess that Nathan loves soccer, and he wanted to see him play it and to say hi. So he's exactly what we want in a teacher. They started school on August 9th, and they have yet to utter the word social studies in any of his classes. It isn't Mr. Jankowski's fault. It's the reality of our culture. So our students' foundation for historical study is often weak by the time they get to middle school, but what high school teachers are expected to ensure that our students know and are able to do according to standards hasn't changed. This is a joke, right? This is a complete joke. And yet, Think of the power that you actually have. 5 minutes with a good historical question and a compelling narrative can make a difference for students. Consistent lessons that challenge students to both comprehend and question the structure of the stories historians tell can make a difference. Sometimes as teachers, you get to select the primary sources that you use with your students, and sometimes these sources are determined for you. But when it comes down to it, you control the narrative. You decide how to help your students engage in interpretation, and you decide how to incorporate these sources into meaningful accounts. You decide to give your students the opportunity to challenge your narrative, to engage in deliberative discussion in your classroom, and to build the habits of mind that are required to be a free person. I have the privilege of working with undergraduates who want to be history teachers. And in a recent class, we were discussing Fritz Fischer's book, The Memory Hole. In his book, Fischer argues that anti-historians from the right and anti-historians from the left have used history as a tool for contemporary political agendas. In our discussion, one of my students posed the question, could politicians reinvent history with their own narrative if people really understood what the discipline is? As I often try to do, I didn't respond, and instead I sort of raised my eyebrows and my hands and kicked it back to the class. And after a moment, another student replied, well, it would be a lot harder. So let's make it harder. Let's expose students to the method and structure of history, to its central concepts and interpretive frameworks. Let's encourage them to challenge us with respect to our organization of courses. Let's engage students in the process of analyzing and crafting evidence-based interpretations and in having a stake in the story of the human experience. Let's focus on narrating the American past, all of it, that which makes us proud and that which brings us pain, so that our students can become the thoughtful, introspective, deliberate individuals that are required in a democratic republic. Let's help our students hone their ability to narrate historical thinking. Thank you. We have a couple of minutes for comments or questions, if you want. Yeah.
Just one question about systematic source analysis and the sort of the document and then support or challenge.
Yeah.
And this last question really has me thinking, because we're in a moment of entrenched polarities and that sort of duality of support or challenge. Do students ever do you ask students to say, well, how does this broaden, expand, give nuance to perspective? Because Terry Epstein's work says that basically the kids are coming with their narratives and very little changes, even regarding teacher and the people she studied weren't being as open and transparent with their narratives. But I was just wondering about that.
Yeah. So good language to use there comes from Bob Bain. How does this document support, contest, extend the idea that's being articulated there? And it probably is, just in the summary I gave, a little bit too simplistic to say support or challenge, but oftentimes that's where we start. That's where I've started with students, and that's what I try to get the teaching candidates to do, just as a big picture thinking. But it is that, how does this complicate our understanding of this source is a much better way to do it. But getting people to think about that and think in that way and to challenge their own narrative frameworks or to even recognize what they're doing is several weeks in attempt and probably not success. I completely agree with you there. Let's go to lunch.
Thank you so much. As you'll notice on your program, after lunch, there is a breakout session in the Missouri room with Sarah. We just call it Conversations with Sarah Drake Brown, and you're free to come and bring other thoughts and questions or subjects you wish to explore in a conversational format. We have a rich collection of breakout sessions this afternoon, so I know it's hard to choose where to go. I also have been advised by the folks who've prepared lunch that we have an outstanding lunch available, and it will be right outside, and there will be somewhere in the midst of the lunch, there are still door prizes. Now, for those of you who were not here yesterday, be assured that my door prize monitors saved half of the door prize